The morning sun cast long shadows across the war-torn landscape as Elena Kozlova adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. She had been lying in the same position for over 6 hours, hidden beneath a carefully constructed camouflage of dead branches and mud-stained cloth. Her breathing was steady, controlled. Each exhale timed perfectly with the rhythm of her heartbeat. At 24 years old, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled marksmen in her regiment, but today would test every skill she had learned in her 2 years of combat. The valley below stretched for nearly 3 kilometers, dotted with abandoned farmhouses and burned-out vehicles from previous battles. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were planning a major offensive through this very corridor, and Elena's mission was simple in theory but deadly in execution: eliminate high-value targets and disrupt enemy communications for as long as possible, then disappear without a trace. Her commanding officer, Major Petrov, had briefed her the night before in hushed tones inside a bombed-out church. The candlelight flickered across his weathered face as he spread out detailed maps and reconnaissance photos. Enemy patrol schedules, guard rotations, communication relay points. Everything had been meticulously documented by advanced scouts who had risked their lives to gather this intelligence. "You'll be completely on your own out there," Petrov had warned, his finger tracing the planned infiltration route. "No backup, no extraction team, no radio contact once you're in position. If something goes wrong, if you're discovered or surrounded, you'll have to rely entirely on your training and instincts." Elena had nodded silently, studying the terrain features and memorizing every detail. She had volunteered for this mission despite knowing the odds of survival were less than favorable. Too many good soldiers had been lost attempting similar operations, either killed in firefights or captured and tortured for information before being executed. Now, as she lay motionless in her concealed position overlooking the main supply route, Elena reflected on the path that had led her here. Born in a small farming village outside Stalingrad, she had grown up hunting with her father and older brothers. Her natural marksmanship ability had been evident from childhood. She could consistently hit targets that seasoned hunters missed. When the war reached her village and her brothers were conscripted, Elena had volunteered for military service despite her mother's tearful protests. The military training had been brutal but necessary. Weeks of physical conditioning, weapons training, camouflage techniques, and survival skills had transformed the farm girl into a lethal weapon. Her instructors quickly recognized her exceptional abilities and recommended her for specialized sniper training. The advanced course had pushed her to her absolute limits, crawling through mud and ice, remaining motionless for entire days, learning to control every bodily function to avoid detection. A slight movement in the valley below caught her attention, snapping her back to the present moment. Through her scope, she could see a small convoy approaching from the east. 3 military vehicles moving at moderate speed along the dirt road. Elena adjusted her position slightly, feeling the familiar weight of her rifle against her shoulder. The weapon was a modified Mosin Nagant, carefully zeroed and maintained to ensure maximum accuracy at extended ranges. She had painted her face with mud and soot before dawn, breaking up the recognizable human features that might catch an enemy soldier's eye. Her ghillie suit was a masterpiece of fieldcraft, constructed over many months using local vegetation, scraps of burlap, and specially treated fabric that would blend seamlessly with the autumn landscape. Every element had been tested and refined through countless hours of practice. The convoy was now within optimal range. Elena could clearly see the lead vehicle through her scope, a half-track carrying what appeared to be communication equipment and several high-ranking officers. This was exactly the type of target she had been ordered to prioritize. She controlled her breathing, allowing her heart rate to slow as she prepared for the shot. Years of training had taught her to consider multiple factors simultaneously: wind speed and direction, target movement, bullet drop over distance, and most importantly, the immediate escape route she would need after revealing her position. Elena had already identified 3 separate withdrawal paths, each leading to different predetermined rally points where she could potentially evade pursuit. The crosshairs settled on her chosen target, an officer wearing distinctive insignia who appeared to be studying maps in the passenger seat. Elena's finger found the trigger, applying steady pressure while maintaining perfect sight alignment. The mathematics of long-range shooting ran through her mind automatically. Range estimation, environmental conditions, ammunition characteristics, all processed in seconds through muscle memory and experience. At the moment of firing, Elena felt the familiar recoil and immediately began her practiced post-shot routine. She observed the impact, confirmed the target was neutralized, then quickly began breaking down her position. There would be no time for follow-up shots. The sound of gunfire would immediately alert every enemy unit within several kilometers to her general location. The chaos in the convoy below was immediate and predictable. Vehicles swerved off the road, soldiers dove for cover, and radio chatter exploded as unit commanders attempted to coordinate a response. Elena smiled grimly as she packed her equipment with practiced efficiency. She had maybe 2 minutes before the first search teams would begin moving toward her last known position. Her escape route led down the reverse slope of the ridge, taking advantage of a shallow ravine that would provide concealment from visual observation. Elena moved quickly but carefully, avoiding any actions that might create noise or leave obvious tracks. Every step was deliberate, every decision calculated to maximize her chances of reaching the first rally point undetected. Behind her, she could hear the growing sound of military vehicles and shouting voices as enemy forces began organizing their search efforts. Multiple units would be converging on the area, setting up perimeters and beginning systematic sweeps of the terrain. Elena knew they would find her firing position within minutes. The spent cartridge case and compressed vegetation would reveal exactly where she had been lying. The first rally point was a cluster of large boulders about 800 meters from her shooting position. Elena reached it without incident, pausing briefly to assess the tactical situation. Through her binoculars, she could see enemy soldiers already climbing toward her former hide site. Their movements were professional and coordinated. These were experienced combat troops, not the poorly trained conscripts she had encountered in previous engagements. Elena made a quick tactical decision to bypass the second rally point and head directly toward the third, which offered better concealment and multiple escape routes. This would mean traveling through more dangerous terrain, but the enemy's search pattern seemed to be focusing on the more obvious withdrawal routes. The next phase of her movement took her through a section of dense woodland that had been heavily damaged by artillery bombardments. Fallen trees and shell craters provided excellent concealment, but made silent movement extremely challenging. Elena picked her way carefully through the debris, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. After 30 minutes of careful movement, she reached the edge of the wooded area and found herself facing an open field approximately 400 meters wide. This was the most dangerous part of her planned escape route. Any enemy forces with elevated observation positions would have clear sight lines across the entire area. Elena studied the terrain carefully, looking for any features that might provide concealment during her crossing. A shallow creek meandered across the field, its banks lined with tall grass and scattered brush. The water would be cold and uncomfortable, but crawling along the stream bed would keep her below the natural sight line and provide some protection from observation. Elena made her decision and began the slow, methodical process of low crawling toward the creek. The icy water soaked through her clothing immediately, but Elena ignored the discomfort and focused on maintaining proper noise discipline. Every movement had to be silent and controlled. A single splash or rustling sound could alert enemy patrols to her location. She estimated it would take nearly an hour to traverse the field using this method. Halfway across the open area, Elena heard the distinct sound of aircraft engines approaching from the east. She pressed herself flat against the creek bank and remained motionless as 2 enemy reconnaissance planes passed overhead, flying a search pattern at low altitude. The pilots would be looking for any signs of movement or unusual disturbances in the landscape below. After the aircraft passed, Elena resumed her movement along the creek bed. Her muscles ached from the prolonged physical strain, and the cold water was beginning to affect her dexterity, but she maintained her steady pace. Survival depended on reaching the safety of the wooded area on the far side of the field before enemy ground forces could establish effective blocking positions. As she neared the opposite tree line, Elena could hear vehicles moving along roads both north and south of her position. The enemy was clearly deploying significant resources to locate and capture or kill her. This level of response indicated that her successful shot had eliminated someone important, possibly a senior commander or technical specialist whose death would have strategic implications. Elena reached the safety of the woods and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The first phase of her mission had been completed successfully, and she had managed to break contact with enemy forces without being detected. However, she knew the real challenge was just beginning. Enemy patrols would continue searching for her throughout the day and night, using dogs, aircraft, and systematic sweeps to locate her hiding places. Her next objective was to reach a predetermined safe house located in an abandoned mill, approximately 15 kilometers to the west. The route would take her through enemy-controlled territory, requiring her to avoid multiple patrol routes and observation posts. Elena checked her map and compass, confirming her planned route and identifying key terrain features she would use for navigation. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows as Elena resumed her movement through the forest. She traveled in short bounds, moving from one concealed position to another while constantly scanning for signs of enemy activity. Her training had taught her to use all her senses, not just sight, but hearing and even smell could provide early warning of approaching threats. After several hours of careful movement, Elena reached the edge of the forest and found herself overlooking a small village that stood directly in her path to the safe house. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could see people moving between the buildings. The challenge was determining whether the village was under enemy control or if the civilian population might be sympathetic to her cause. Elena settled into a concealed observation position and began a systematic study of the village layout and activity patterns. She noted the locations of possible enemy positions, the movements of civilian residents, and most importantly, any signs of military vehicles or equipment. This reconnaissance phase was critical. Making the wrong decision about whether to bypass or move through the village could mean the difference between mission success and capture or death. As evening approached, Elena observed several concerning indicators that suggested enemy presence in the village. Regular patrols of armed soldiers moved through the streets at predictable intervals, and she could see radio antennas on several buildings that would not normally be found in a rural farming community. Additionally, the civilian population seemed to be observing strict movement restrictions. People hurried between buildings and avoided gathering in groups. Elena made the tactical decision to bypass the village entirely, even though this would add several hours to her journey and require crossing more difficult terrain. She began moving north, staying within the tree line while working her way around the settled area. This route would take her through rougher country, but it would minimize the risk of enemy contact. The nighttime movement was both more dangerous and more secure. Elena could move more freely under cover of darkness, but the risk of accidentally stumbling into enemy positions was significantly higher. She relied heavily on her trained ability to move silently and her well-developed night vision to navigate safely through the unfamiliar terrain. By midnight, Elena had successfully bypassed the village and was approaching the general area where the safe house should be located. However, she was becoming increasingly concerned about the level of enemy activity in the region. Throughout her movement, she had observed or heard evidence of numerous patrols, vehicle movements, and even aircraft activity continuing well into the night hours. The safe house was supposed to be an abandoned mill on a small stream, marked by distinctive stone walls and a partially collapsed roof. Elena had memorized the building's description and its precise location coordinates, but actually finding it in the darkness proved more challenging than anticipated. She spent nearly 2 hours moving in careful search patterns before finally locating the correct structure. The mill appeared to be genuinely abandoned and showed no signs of recent enemy activity. Elena approached cautiously, checking for signs of booby traps or surveillance devices before finally entering the building. The interior was exactly as described in her briefing. Empty grain storage areas, rusted machinery, and a concealed cache of supplies hidden beneath loose floorboards in the main room. Elena retrieved the cached supplies, which included additional ammunition, emergency rations, medical supplies, and a change of clothing. Most importantly, there was a detailed map showing alternative extraction routes and additional safe houses throughout the region. She studied this information carefully, updating her mental picture of the tactical situation and available options. Her original extraction plan called for her to remain in the area for several more days, conducting additional sniper attacks against enemy targets of opportunity. However, the intensity of the enemy response to her first successful engagement suggested that continuing the mission as originally planned might be extremely dangerous. Elena would need to make a critical decision about whether to press forward with additional attacks or begin moving toward the extraction point immediately. As dawn approached, Elena settled into the most secure section of the mill to rest and plan her next moves. She had successfully completed the first phase of her mission and evaded capture despite intensive enemy search efforts. However, she knew that the most challenging part of the operation lay ahead. She would need to remain undetected while continuing to operate behind enemy lines for several more days. The second day behind enemy lines began before sunrise, as Elena carefully observed the surrounding area from her hiding place in the abandoned mill. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, constantly alert for any sounds that might indicate discovery. Through gaps in the stone walls, she watched enemy patrols moving along distant roads, their vehicles creating small clouds of dust in the early morning light. Elena had made her decision during the night. She would continue the mission as planned, but with modifications based on the intelligence she had gathered about enemy response patterns. The intensity of their search efforts actually presented new opportunities. With so many troops committed to hunting for her, other areas might be less heavily defended, creating chances for additional high-value targets. Her tactical analysis of the previous day's engagement had revealed several important insights. The enemy's response had been rapid and well-coordinated, suggesting they had established communication protocols specifically for dealing with sniper attacks. However, their search patterns followed predictable military doctrine, focusing on the most likely escape routes while giving less attention to more difficult terrain that experienced soldiers might avoid. Elena spent the morning hours studying her new maps and planning her next engagement. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy headquarters units rotated between 3 different locations in the region, never staying in the same place for more than 24 hours. Today, according to the schedule she had memorized, a senior command group should be operating from a hilltop position approximately 8 kilometers to the southeast. This target presented both opportunities and significant risks. The command post would likely contain multiple high-value targets, including senior officers and communication specialists, whose elimination would seriously disrupt enemy operations. However, headquarters units were typically protected by enhanced security measures, including additional guards, early warning systems, and rapid reaction forces positioned nearby. Elena began preparing for the long movement to her next shooting position. She carefully cleaned and inspected her rifle, ensuring that every component was functioning perfectly. The weapon had performed flawlessly during her first engagement, but desert, sand, and moisture could cause reliability problems if not properly maintained. She also checked her remaining ammunition, counting each round and examining the cartridges for any signs of damage. The camouflage that had served her so well needed updating for different terrain. Elena spent considerable time modifying her ghillie suit, replacing vegetation that had dried out or become damaged, with fresh materials that would blend with the area around her next target. This attention to detail was crucial. Even small errors in camouflage could mean the difference between remaining hidden and being spotted by alert sentries. Her route to the target area would take her through some of the most dangerous terrain she had yet encountered. The path led across several open areas where concealment would be minimal, past known enemy patrol routes, and through a section of hills that enemy forces were using as observation posts. Elena would need to time her movement precisely, taking advantage of weather conditions and enemy activity patterns to minimize exposure. As midday approached, Elena began her movement toward the target. She left the mill through a concealed exit that opened onto a dry stream bed, providing initial concealment as she began working her way southeast. The autumn weather was cooperating. Overcast skies would limit aerial observation, and a slight breeze would help mask any small sounds she might make during movement. The first few kilometers passed without incident as Elena moved through relatively dense forest cover. She maintained a steady but cautious pace, pausing frequently to observe and listen for any signs of enemy activity. Her training had taught her to think like the enemy, to anticipate where they would place observation posts, which routes they would patrol, and how they would respond to various tactical situations. Elena's first major challenge came when she reached the edge of the forest and found herself facing a steep hillside covered with loose rock and sparse vegetation. The slope was approximately 600 meters long and offered virtually no concealment from observation. Worse, she could see evidence of enemy activity on the ridgeline above military vehicles, and what appeared to be a temporary observation post. She spent nearly an hour studying the tactical situation and considering her options. The most direct route would require crossing the exposed slope in broad daylight, with enemy observers positioned above her. Alternative routes would add hours to her journey and might cause her to miss the optimal engagement window at her target location. Elena made the difficult decision to attempt the crossing using a technique she had practiced extensively during training but never employed in actual combat. She would move in very short bounds, taking advantage of every small depression or shadow that might provide even momentary concealment. The key was to move so slowly and carefully that any observers would dismiss her movements as natural phenomena, shifting shadows, wind-blown vegetation, or small animals. The crossing took nearly 3 hours of painstaking effort. Elena moved only when conditions were optimal, when clouds passed overhead, when wind stirred the vegetation, or when she was certain the enemy observers were looking in other directions. Each bound was measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, and she spent long minutes motionless between each movement. Halfway up the slope, Elena heard voices approaching from her left flank. She pressed herself against a small outcropping of rock and remained absolutely motionless as an enemy patrol passed within 30 meters of her position. The soldiers were moving casually, talking among themselves and clearly not expecting to encounter any threats in this area. Elena could have easily eliminated several of them with her rifle, but doing so would have compromised her primary mission and alerted every enemy unit in the region to her exact location. After the patrol passed, Elena resumed her careful ascent. Her muscles ached from the prolonged physical strain of moving so slowly and precisely, but she maintained her discipline and continued the methodical process. As she neared the top of the ridge, she could hear radio chatter and vehicle engines from the enemy observation post, now less than 200 meters away. Elena reached the crest of the ridge and immediately moved into a small depression that would provide concealment while she observed the enemy position. Through her binoculars, she could see a well-established observation post, with multiple radio antennas, several vehicles, and at least a dozen soldiers. More importantly, she could see that they were indeed monitoring the surrounding area systematically, using optical equipment to scan for any signs of movement or unusual activity. The discovery explained why her crossing had been so critical. The enemy had established overlapping observation zones that covered most of the likely infiltration routes in the region. Elena realized that her success in remaining undetected was partly due to luck, but mostly due to her extreme patience and careful movement techniques. From her position on the ridge, Elena could see her ultimate target area in the distance. The enemy command post was located on another hilltop approximately 3 kilometers away, identifiable by its cluster of antenna arrays and defensive positions. She could also see several possible shooting positions between her current location and the target, each offering different advantages and disadvantages in terms of range, concealment, and escape routes. Elena began her movement toward the target area, now moving through terrain that offered better concealment but presented new challenges. The hills were covered with dense brush and scattered trees, providing visual cover but making silent movement much more difficult. Every step had to be carefully planned to avoid branches that might snap or loose rocks that might cause noise. The afternoon was progressing, and Elena was becoming increasingly aware of time pressure. Her intelligence indicated that the enemy command post typically relocated just before dark, which meant she had perhaps 3 hours to reach her shooting position, make her shots, and begin her escape. The tight timeline added stress to an already dangerous situation, but Elena had trained extensively for operations under time pressure. As she approached the target area, Elena began encountering more frequent signs of enemy activity. She observed several patrol routes that were being used regularly, found evidence of temporary defensive positions, and noted communication lines that had been strung through the trees. The enemy was clearly taking security seriously in this area, probably because of the presence of senior command personnel. Elena selected her final approach route, choosing a path that would bring her to within optimal shooting range while providing the best available concealment and escape options. The route led through a section of particularly dense brush, requiring her to crawl for the final several hundred meters. This would be physically exhausting and time-consuming, but it would minimize her chances of detection during the most critical phase of the operation. The final approach took over an hour of careful crawling through thick vegetation. Elena's clothing was torn in several places, and her hands and face were scratched from thorns and branches, but she had reached her chosen shooting position without being detected. She was now approximately 450 meters from the enemy command post, with a clear line of sight to the target area. Elena began the methodical process of preparing her shooting position. She cleared small branches and debris that might interfere with her rifle, arranged camouflage material to break up her outline, and established sight lines to multiple potential targets. Most importantly, she confirmed her planned escape routes and memorized key terrain features she would need to navigate during her withdrawal. Through her rifle scope, Elena could observe the enemy command post in detail. The position was well organized and professionally constructed, with proper defensive measures and communication procedures clearly in place. She could see several officers moving between different areas of the compound, consulting maps and operating radio equipment. Vehicle traffic was regular but not heavy, suggesting that this was indeed an active command facility rather than a decoy position. Elena identified her primary target, a senior officer who appeared to be directing operations and consulting frequently with subordinates. The man's uniform and behavior clearly indicated high rank, and his elimination would likely cause significant disruption to enemy operations in the region. She also identified several secondary targets, including communication specialists and other officers who appeared to be involved in critical decision-making processes. The shooting conditions were nearly optimal. Wind was minimal, lighting was good, and Elena had a stable shooting position with clear sight lines to the target area. She had been in position for nearly 30 minutes, allowing her to observe target patterns and confirm her range estimates. Everything was ready for the engagement, but Elena forced herself to wait for the ideal moment when maximum damage could be achieved. Her patience was rewarded when the senior officer emerged from a command bunker, accompanied by two other high-ranking personnel. The three men stood together consulting a map, presenting Elena with an opportunity to eliminate multiple targets in rapid succession. She controlled her breathing and settled into her shooting stance, crosshairs aligned on the primary target. The first shot was perfect, immediately neutralizing the senior officer. Elena quickly shifted her point of aim and fired a second shot, eliminating one of the accompanying officers before the enemy could react and seek cover. The third potential target disappeared into the bunker before she could acquire a clear shot, but Elena had achieved significant tactical success with her first two rounds. The response at the command post was immediate chaos. Soldiers ran for defensive positions, vehicle engines started, and radio chatter exploded as units throughout the area were alerted to the attack. Elena observed the confusion with professional satisfaction while she quickly prepared to abandon her position. She had perhaps 90 seconds before enemy forces would begin moving toward her location. Elena's withdrawal from the shooting position was necessarily rapid, sacrificing some stealth for speed as she moved toward her primary escape route. Behind her, she could already hear vehicles starting and the sound of troops being organized for pursuit. The enemy response was even faster than she had anticipated, indicating that they had developed specific procedures for dealing with sniper attacks. Her escape route led down the reverse slope of the hill, taking advantage of a shallow ravine that would provide concealment from direct observation. Elena moved as quickly as silence would allow, knowing that speed was now more important than perfect noise discipline. The enemy would be deploying search teams within minutes, and her only chance was to reach the safety of dense forest before they could establish effective blocking positions. As Elena reached the bottom of the ravine, she could hear the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The enemy was clearly committing significant resources to her capture, probably including armored personnel carriers that could move rapidly across the rough terrain. She would need to use every bit of her training and experience to evade the intensive search that was about to begin. Elena's next challenge was crossing another open area, this one nearly 800 meters wide with minimal concealment. Enemy forces would certainly establish observation points overlooking this area, making movement extremely dangerous. However, her planned route included several alternative paths, and Elena quickly made the tactical decision to use the most difficult and least likely option. Instead of crossing the open ground, Elena would follow a circuitous route through a section of swampy terrain that most soldiers would avoid due to the difficult conditions. The route would be longer and more physically demanding, but it would take her through areas where enemy search teams would be less likely to look and where their vehicles would be unable to follow. The swamp was exactly as miserable As Elena had expected, the water was knee-deep in most areas, with a soft mud bottom that made every step an effort. Thick vegetation provided excellent concealment, but also made progress slow and tiring. Most challenging of all, Elena had to maintain noise discipline while moving through water and marsh grass that seemed designed to create sound with every movement. After 2 hours of struggling through the swamp, Elena finally reached solid ground on the far side. She was exhausted, soaked, and covered with mud, but she had successfully evaded the enemy search teams that she could hear operating in other areas. The difficult route had cost her considerable time and energy, but it had probably saved her life by taking her through terrain that enemy forces had not bothered to search thoroughly. As darkness began to fall, Elena found herself in familiar territory. She was approaching the same general area where she had operated during her first day behind enemy lines. However, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Enemy activity in the region had intensified significantly, with regular patrols on all the major routes and aircraft conducting search patterns well into the night hours. Elena needed to find a secure place to rest and plan her next moves, but all of her previously identified hiding places were now likely to be under enemy surveillance. She would need to find new shelter, preferably in an area where enemy forces would not think to look for an experienced operative trying to evade capture. Elena's third night behind enemy lines began with a desperate search for shelter as enemy patrols intensified their hunt throughout the region. The successful elimination of senior command personnel had clearly triggered a massive response, with search teams now operating around the clock, using dogs, aircraft, and systematic grid searches of the terrain. Every safe house and hiding place that Elena had previously identified was now potentially compromised. As she moved through the darkness, Elena could hear the distant barking of tracking dogs being deployed by enemy search teams. The sound sent a chill through her as she realized that her scent trail from the swamp crossing would be relatively easy for trained dogs to follow. She needed to find running water or some other means of breaking the scent trail before the search teams could close the distance. Elena's tactical training included extensive instruction on evading tracking dogs, but the techniques required specific materials and terrain features that might not be available. She remembered lessons about using strong scented substances to mask human odor, crossing streams to break scent trails, and creating false trails to confuse pursuing forces. However, implementing these techniques while exhausted and under extreme time pressure would be extremely challenging. Fortunately, Elena's route took her near a small creek that meandered through the forest. She immediately entered the water and began moving downstream, staying in the creek bed to break her scent trail and eliminate tracks that might be visible to human trackers. The water was shockingly cold, but Elena forced herself to ignore the discomfort and focus on putting as much distance as possible between herself and her last known position. After following the creek for nearly 2 kilometers, Elena emerged at a point where the stream passed under a damaged stone bridge. The structure had been partially destroyed by artillery fire, creating a jumbled pile of broken masonry that offered excellent concealment. More importantly, the bridge was located in an area that had already been thoroughly searched during the initial response to her first attack, making it less likely that enemy forces would return to examine it again. Elena carefully worked her way into a space between fallen stone blocks, creating a hide position that was virtually invisible from any direction. The location offered protection from observation, some shelter from the weather, and multiple escape routes if discovery became imminent. Most critically, the running water of the creek would help mask any sounds she might make and would interfere with the ability of tracking dogs to locate her position. From her hiding place, Elena could observe enemy activity throughout the night. Search teams passed by regularly, their flashlights probing the darkness and their radio chatter indicating the intensity of their efforts. She counted at least 12 different patrol groups operating in her immediate area, far more than she had encountered during her first 2 days behind enemy lines. The enemy's search pattern was methodical and professional, indicating that they were being directed by experienced officers who understood the techniques that trained operatives would use to evade capture. Search teams were checking obvious hiding places, but they were also examining areas that might seem too obvious or too difficult for a fugitive to use. Elena's choice of the damaged bridge was proving to be excellent. The position had already been searched and dismissed as empty. As dawn approached, Elena observed a significant change in enemy tactics. Instead of continuing the intensive search pattern, forces began establishing a series of checkpoints and observation posts along all the major routes in the region. The enemy was clearly shifting from active pursuit to passive containment, attempting to prevent her from leaving the area while systematically eliminating potential hiding places. This tactical change presented both opportunities and dangers for Elena. The reduction in active patrols would make movement easier during daylight hours, but the establishment of fixed positions would make it much more difficult to leave the region when her mission was complete. Enemy commanders were obviously experienced in counterinsurgency operations and understood how to effectively limit the options available to isolated operatives. Elena used the daylight hours to conduct detailed observation of enemy positions and movement patterns. From her concealed location, she could see several checkpoints and had a clear view of the main road that ran through the valley. Enemy soldiers were stopping and searching all civilian traffic, checking identification documents, and examining vehicles for any signs of unusual activity. More concerning was the evidence that enemy forces were beginning to suspect local civilian cooperation with her mission. Elena observed several incidents where civilian vehicles were subjected to extensive searches, and she saw at least one case where civilians were detained for questioning. The enemy's suspicion of the local population was understandable but dangerous. If they began treating all civilians as potential threats, it would make Elena's mission much more difficult. During her observation period, Elena also noted significant changes in enemy communication procedures. Radio traffic was much more encrypted than before, antenna arrays had been repositioned, and new security protocols were clearly in effect. The elimination of senior command personnel had obviously forced the enemy to implement enhanced security measures throughout their entire organization. As the second day of her extended mission progressed, Elena began planning her third major engagement. Intelligence reports had indicated that enemy supply convoys followed predictable routes and schedules, presenting opportunities for disruption attacks that would have strategic value beyond the simple elimination of personnel. However, attacking supply convoys would require different tactics and would probably provoke an even more intensive response. Elena's analysis of the tactical situation suggested that the enemy was expecting her to continue targeting command and communication facilities. A successful attack against supply operations would be unexpected and would force enemy commanders to divert resources to protect their logistics network. Additionally, supply convoys were typically protected by smaller security details that would be easier to evade than the enhanced security around command positions. Her map study revealed that the main supply route passed through a narrow valley approximately 6 kilometers from her current position. The road followed the natural contours of the terrain, with several locations where vehicles would be forced to slow down or stop due to tight curves or steep grades. These areas would provide optimal opportunities for attack, while offering good escape routes into difficult terrain. Elena began preparing for movement to the new target area. Her ammunition supply was becoming a concern. She had fired 4 rounds during her 2 previous engagements and had a limited supply remaining for future operations. Each shot would need to count, not only for tactical effectiveness but also for conservation of resources that could not be resupplied. The route to the supply route interdiction point would take Elena through some of the most dangerous terrain she had yet encountered. Enemy checkpoints controlled all the obvious paths, forcing her to use routes that were physically demanding and time-consuming. The movement would need to be conducted entirely during darkness hours, requiring precise navigation through unfamiliar territory. Elena waited until full darkness before beginning her movement toward the target area. She left her hiding place at the damaged bridge with considerable regret. It had provided excellent security and comfort during a critical period. However, staying in the same location for too long would eventually result in discovery, and her mission required continued offensive action against enemy operations. The first phase of her movement took Elena through dense forest that provided excellent concealment but made navigation challenging in the darkness. She relied heavily on her compass and her ability to read terrain features by touch and sound to maintain her planned route. Every few hundred meters, she paused to listen for any signs of enemy activity and to confirm her position using recognizable landmarks. Elena's progress was slower than planned due to the challenging terrain and the need for extreme caution. Enemy patrols were still operating throughout the area, and the darkness that concealed her movement also made it more likely that she might accidentally encounter hostile forces. She had several close calls where she heard approaching footsteps or vehicle engines just in time to take cover and remain motionless until the threat passed. After 4 hours of careful movement, Elena reached a position overlooking the main supply route. The road was exactly as depicted in her intelligence reports. A narrow 2-lane route that wound through hills and valleys, with limited opportunities for vehicles to turn around or leave the roadway. Perfect terrain for an interdiction attack, provided she could position herself correctly and plan an effective escape route. Elena spent considerable time conducting reconnaissance of the target area. She identified several potential shooting positions, each offering different advantages in terms of range, concealment, and escape routes. Most importantly, she observed the road for over an hour, noting traffic patterns and trying to determine when supply convoys were most likely to pass through the area. The intelligence reports had indicated that major supply movements typically occurred during early morning hours, taking advantage of reduced civilian traffic and better security conditions. Elena's observation confirmed this pattern. She saw several military vehicles pass during her watch, but no major convoys. The timing suggested that she would need to be in position and ready well before dawn. Elena selected her shooting position based on multiple factors: optimal range to the target area, excellent concealment and camouflage opportunities, and multiple escape routes leading into terrain that would be difficult for vehicles to navigate. The position was located on a hillside approximately 300 meters from the road, with clear sight lines to a section where vehicles would be forced to reduce speed due to a sharp curve. Preparing the shooting position required several hours of careful work. Elena had to clear sight lines without creating obvious disturbance to the vegetation, arrange camouflage materials to break up her outline, and establish shooting supports that would provide stability for accurate long-range fire. Most importantly, she prepared her escape routes, clearing obstacles and memorizing key terrain features that would guide her movement in darkness. As dawn approached, Elena settled into her final shooting position and began the wait for suitable targets. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours and was feeling the effects of physical and mental fatigue, but her training had taught her to function effectively under such conditions. Adrenaline and professional focus would sustain her through the engagement and subsequent escape. The first vehicles to appear were not the supply convoy she was expecting, but rather a patrol of armored cars conducting route security. Elena remained motionless as the vehicles passed, knowing that firing on the patrol would alert the supply convoy to danger and cause them to either turn back or take alternative routes. Patience was critical to mission success. 30 minutes after the patrol passed, Elena observed dust clouds approaching from the east that indicated a much larger convoy. Through her rifle scope, she could see a line of trucks preceded and followed by escort vehicles, exactly the type of target she had been ordered to engage. The convoy was moving at moderate speed, suggesting that the route security patrol had not detected any threats. Elena controlled her breathing and settled into her shooting stance as the convoy approached the optimal engagement area. Her plan was to disable the lead vehicle first, blocking the road and forcing the following vehicles to stop or bunch up. This would create multiple targets and would prevent easy escape if her shots were accurate and well-timed. The lead escort vehicle entered her target zone, and Elena placed her crosshairs on the driver's compartment. She fired, observed the impact, and immediately shifted her aim to the first supply truck. The second shot disabled the truck's engine, causing it to coast to a stop and block the roadway. Elena's third shot targeted the trailing escort vehicle, eliminating its ability to pursue her during the escape phase. The convoy was now effectively neutralized, with vehicles blocked on the narrow road and personnel taking cover from continued sniper fire. Elena fired 2 additional shots at opportunity targets before beginning her immediate withdrawal from the shooting position. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes, but she had successfully disrupted a major supply operation and eliminated several vehicles and their crews. Elena's escape from the engagement area was necessarily rapid and direct. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of radio traffic, vehicle engines, and troops being organized for pursuit. The enemy response was even faster than in her previous engagements, indicating that they had developed specific procedures and had reaction forces positioned to respond quickly to supply route attacks. Her primary escape route led down the reverse slope of the hill and into a section of dense forest that would provide concealment from aerial observation. Elena moved as quickly as stealth would allow, knowing that enemy forces would be converging on her last known position within minutes. The sound of helicopter engines in the distance confirmed that the enemy was deploying all available resources to locate and engage her. As Elena reached the safety of the forest, she could hear explosions from the direction of the convoy, probably demolition charges being used to clear the blocked road or destroy damaged vehicles to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The success of her interdiction attack was evident from the level of response it had provoked. Elena's immediate priority was to put maximum distance between herself and the engagement area before enemy search teams could establish blocking positions. Her planned route would take her through difficult terrain that vehicles could not navigate, but it would also require her to cross several open areas where she would be vulnerable to observation from aircraft. The next few hours would be critical to her survival. Enemy forces were now fully alerted to her presence and capabilities, and they would be implementing every available resource to capture or eliminate her. Elena would need to use every skill she had learned during her training and combat experience to evade the intensive manhunt that was about to begin. Elena's successful attack on the supply convoy had achieved significant tactical results, but it had also escalated the situation to a new level of intensity. Enemy commanders would now be forced to commit substantial resources to protect their logistics operations, diverting forces from other missions and reducing their operational effectiveness throughout the region. However, Elena's own situation had become correspondingly more dangerous. She was now facing the equivalent of an entire battalion committed to her capture, operating in terrain that they knew well and using resources that she could not match. The next phase of her mission would test every aspect of her training, experience, and personal courage. The fourth day behind enemy lines began with Elena trapped in an increasingly desperate tactical situation. The successful attack on the supply convoy had triggered an overwhelming response that transformed the entire region into an active battlefield. Enemy forces were now operating under the assumption that they were facing a trained special operations unit rather than a single sniper, and their countermeasures had escalated accordingly. Elena found herself hiding in a shallow cave that she had discovered during her nighttime movement away from the convoy attack site. The natural shelter was cramped and uncomfortable, but it provided complete concealment from aerial observation and was located in terrain so difficult that ground search teams would be unlikely to find it without systematic exploration of every possible hiding place in the region. Through the cave entrance, Elena could observe enemy helicopter patrols conducting grid searches of the surrounding hills. The aircraft were flying systematic patterns at low altitude, their crews using optical equipment to examine every feature of the landscape below. The intensity of the aerial search was unlike anything Elena had encountered during her previous combat experience. More concerning were the radio intercepts that Elena could pick up using a small receiver she carried for intelligence gathering. Enemy communications indicated that they had brought in specialized tracking units, including teams with trained dogs and soldiers with experience in counter-sniper operations. The enemy was clearly taking her mission seriously enough to divert significant resources from other operations throughout the theater. Elena's ammunition situation was becoming critical. She had fired 7 rounds during her 3 separate engagements and had only 5 rounds remaining. Each shot would need to count not only for tactical effectiveness but also for her own survival. The reality was that she might need to use her remaining ammunition for defensive purposes rather than continuing offensive operations against enemy targets. Her food and water supplies were also running low. Elena had been operating on reduced rations since the beginning of her mission, but the physical demands of constant movement and the stress of remaining hidden were taking their toll. She estimated that she had perhaps 2 days of supplies remaining, after which she would need to either resupply from enemy sources or begin moving toward extraction regardless of mission status. Most critically, Elena's planned extraction point was now certainly under enemy surveillance. Intelligence protocols required that extraction sites be monitored if operations in the area had been compromised, and the enemy would obviously be watching all likely escape routes. Elena would need to either fight her way to the extraction point or find alternative means of leaving the operational area. As the day progressed, Elena observed significant changes in enemy tactics and deployment patterns. Instead of continuing the intensive search operations, enemy forces began establishing permanent observation posts on all the high ground in the region. They were clearly shifting from active hunting to passive containment, attempting to prevent her from moving freely while systematically reducing the area where she could hide. This tactical change suggested that enemy commanders understood they were dealing with a highly trained operative who could not be located through conventional search methods. The establishment of observation posts indicated that they were prepared to maintain surveillance for an extended period, gradually tightening their control until escape became impossible. Elena realized that her mission parameters had fundamentally changed. Instead of conducting additional attacks against enemy targets, her primary objective now had to be survival and successful extraction. However, the enemy's containment strategy made conventional extraction extremely difficult. She would need to create some form of distraction or diversion that would allow her to break through their surveillance network. During her observation from the cave, Elena noted that enemy forces were following predictable patterns in their establishment of observation posts and patrol routes. Their positions were professionally sited and well coordinated, but they followed standard military doctrine that could be anticipated by someone with appropriate training. This adherence to doctrine might provide opportunities for someone willing to take calculated risks. Elena spent considerable time studying the enemy's deployment pattern and looking for weaknesses that she might be able to exploit. The observation posts were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the most likely movement routes, but there were gaps in coverage in areas where the terrain was particularly difficult, or where multiple posts could not effectively coordinate their surveillance. Her analysis revealed that the enemy's surveillance network had one significant vulnerability. The observation posts were static and could only monitor fixed areas effectively. If Elena could move during periods of limited visibility or through terrain that the posts could not observe effectively, she might be able to penetrate their containment without detection. Weather conditions were beginning to change in Elena's favor. Cloud cover was increasing, and weather reports she could intercept suggested that fog and rain were likely during the night hours. These conditions would reduce the effectiveness of enemy observation and would provide concealment during movement. However, the same conditions would make navigation more difficult and would increase the physical challenges of movement through rough terrain. Elena made the tactical decision to attempt a breakout during the night, using the expected weather conditions to mask her movement toward an alternative extraction point. Her map showed several possible routes that would take her through terrain too difficult for effective surveillance, but these routes would be extremely demanding and would require precise navigation under adverse conditions. Preparation for the breakout required careful planning of every detail. Elena studied her maps extensively, memorizing key terrain features and compass bearings that would guide her movement in limited visibility. She also prepared her equipment, ensuring that everything was secured against loss and arranged for silent movement through difficult terrain. As darkness fell, the weather began cooperating with Elena's plans. A light rain began falling, reducing visibility and creating background noise that would help mask any sounds she might make during movement. More importantly, the rain would interfere with the effectiveness of any thermal imaging equipment that enemy forces might be using for surveillance. Elena left the cave just after midnight, moving carefully down the steep slope toward the valley floor. Her route would take her through a series of connected ravines and stream beds that would provide concealment from observation posts positioned on the surrounding hills. The terrain was treacherous in darkness and rain, but it offered her best chance of avoiding detection during the critical initial phase of her movement. The first kilometer of movement proceeded without incident as Elena worked her way through the ravine system. The rain was steadily increasing, creating muddy conditions that made footing uncertain, but provided excellent concealment from visual and thermal observation. Elena's waterproof clothing was keeping her core dry, but her hands and feet were becoming numb from the cold and wet conditions. Elena's first major challenge came when she reached the end of the ravine system and found herself facing a section of open ground that could not be bypassed. The area was approximately 400 meters wide and was certainly under observation from multiple enemy posts. However, the rain and darkness provided enough concealment that movement might be possible if executed with extreme care. Elena spent nearly 30 minutes observing the open area and looking for any signs of enemy activity or surveillance equipment. She could see the lights from observation posts on the surrounding hills, but the poor visibility conditions seemed to be limiting their effectiveness. Most importantly, she detected no signs of ground patrols or other security measures in the immediate area. The crossing required Elena to use every stealth technique she had learned during her training. She moved in very short bounds, pausing frequently to listen and observe for any signs that she had been detected. The rain-soaked ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps, but it was also slippery and unstable, requiring constant attention to avoid falls that might create noise or visible movement. Halfway across the open area, Elena heard the distinctive sound of helicopter engines approaching from the east. She immediately dropped prone and remained motionless as the aircraft passed overhead, flying a search pattern at low altitude. The crew was clearly using thermal imaging equipment, evidenced by the slow, systematic flight pattern, but the rain and cloud cover seemed to be reducing the effectiveness of their sensors. After the helicopter passed, Elena resumed her movement across the open ground. The final 200 meters felt interminable, with every step potentially exposing her to observation from enemy posts. However, her patience and careful technique were successful. She reached the concealment of the forest on the far side without any indication that she had been detected. Elena's route now led through several kilometers of dense forest that would provide excellent concealment, but would make navigation extremely challenging in the dark and rain. She relied heavily on her compass and her ability to read terrain features by touch and sound to maintain her planned direction. The physical demands of movement through wet, dense vegetation were exhausting, but Elena forced herself to maintain a steady pace. After 3 hours of movement through the forest, Elena reached a position overlooking a major road that she would need to cross to continue toward her alternative extraction point. The road was clearly under surveillance. She could see vehicle patrols moving regularly in both directions, and there were obvious signs of checkpoint operations at several locations along the route. Elena observed the road traffic for over an hour, looking for patterns that might provide opportunities for safe crossing. Enemy security procedures were thorough and professional, with regular patrols and overlapping coverage that would make undetected crossing extremely difficult. However, Ella noted that patrol timing was predictable, providing brief windows when sections of road were not under direct observation. The road crossing required precise timing and rapid movement. Elena waited for the optimal moment when patrol schedules created a gap in coverage, then sprinted across the open roadway and into concealment on the far side. The crossing took less than 30 seconds, but it was one of the most dangerous moments of her entire mission due to the risk of detection and the lack of alternative escape routes. On the far side of the road, Elena found herself in familiar territory. She was approaching the general area where she had operated during the first day of her mission. However, the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Enemy activity was now concentrated in this region, with multiple observation posts and patrol bases that had not existed during her initial operations. Elena's alternative extraction point was located in a section of hills approximately 8 kilometers to the west. The route would take her through terrain that was less familiar, but offered better concealment opportunities than the areas where enemy forces were concentrating their search efforts. However, the distance involved in the challenging terrain meant that she would need to maintain movement throughout the remainder of the night and possibly into the following day. As Elena resumed her movement toward the extraction point, she began encountering increasing signs of enemy activity. The forest was crisscrossed with patrol routes that were being used regularly, and she found evidence of temporary observation posts that had been established to monitor key terrain features. The enemy's containment strategy was clearly more extensive than she had initially realized. Elena's progress slowed significantly as she was forced to take increasingly circuitous routes to avoid enemy positions. What should have been a direct movement was becoming a complex series of detours and delays as she worked around patrol routes and observation posts. The time delays were concerning because Elena needed to reach the extraction point within a specific window to meet the planned pickup schedule. Despite the challenging conditions and enemy activity, Elena continued to make steady progress toward her objective. Her training and experience were serving her well in the demanding conditions, and her physical conditioning was proving adequate for the sustained effort required. Most importantly, her careful movement techniques were continuing to keep her undetected despite the intensive enemy surveillance in the region. As dawn approached, Elena found herself within 2 kilometers of the alternative extraction point, but still faced significant obstacles. Enemy forces had established multiple checkpoints and patrol bases along the most direct routes, forcing her to consider more dangerous alternatives or potentially missing the extraction window entirely. Elena made the critical decision to continue movement during daylight hours, accepting increased risk of detection in order to maintain her schedule for extraction. The decision was dangerous but necessary. Missing the extraction window would mean remaining in the operational area for at least another 24 hours, during which time enemy containment efforts would only become more effective. The final approach to the extraction point would test every skill Elena had developed during her military career. Enemy surveillance was at its most intense in the area where she was attempting to operate, and the margin for error was essentially zero. A single mistake in movement, timing, or judgment would likely result in capture or death. Elena settled into a concealed observation position overlooking the extraction point and began the final phase of her mission, waiting for the extraction team while remaining undetected by enemy forces that were actively searching for her throughout the region. The next few hours would determine whether her mission would end in success or disaster. The final hours of Elena's mission began with her positioned in a shallow depression overlooking the alternative extraction point, watching for any signs of the pickup team while simultaneously monitoring enemy patrols that were operating dangerously close to her location. The rain had stopped, but heavy cloud cover continued to provide concealment from aerial observation. Elena estimated that she had perhaps 3 hours before the extraction window would close, and she would be stranded behind enemy lines indefinitely. Through her binoculars, Elena could observe the extraction point clearly, a small clearing in the forest that was large enough for helicopter operations, but small enough to be easily overlooked during casual observation. The site had been chosen specifically because it was located in terrain that would be difficult for enemy forces to reach quickly, providing some protection for the extraction team during the critical pickup phase. However, Elena's observation revealed that enemy forces were much closer to the extraction point than intelligence reports had indicated. She could see at least 2 patrol bases within a few kilometers of the clearing, and regular helicopter patrols were passing overhead at intervals that would make extraction operations extremely dangerous. The tactical situation was far from optimal, but Elena had no alternative. This was her only chance to leave the operational area alive. Elena's position overlooking the extraction point also allowed her to observe enemy activity patterns throughout the surrounding region. The intensity of their search operations had not diminished despite her successful evasion over the past several days. If anything, enemy commanders seemed to have increased their commitment of resources, bringing in additional specialized units and expanding their surveillance network. The most concerning development was the presence of what appeared to be counter-sniper teams operating in the area. Elena could observe soldiers using specialized equipment and moving in patterns that were characteristic of trained marksmen conducting counter-sniper operations. These teams represented a significant threat because they would be familiar with the tactics and techniques that Elena was using to remain hidden. As the morning progressed, Elena began to suspect that enemy forces might have some intelligence about the extraction operation. Patrol activity seemed to be concentrating in areas that would interfere with helicopter operations, and observation posts were being established in locations that would provide oversight of potential landing zones. The enemy's deployment pattern was too convenient to be entirely coincidental. Elena's communication equipment included an emergency beacon that could be activated to signal the extraction team, but using it would also reveal her exact location to any enemy forces monitoring radio frequencies. The decision of when to activate the beacon would be critical. Too early would expose her to detection and attack, but too late might mean that the extraction team would be unable to locate her in time. Her observation of the tactical situation suggested that enemy forces were implementing a sophisticated counter-extraction strategy. They were not simply searching for Elena randomly, but were systematically covering areas and routes that extraction teams would need to use. This level of tactical sophistication indicated that enemy commanders had extensive experience with special operations and understood how to counter them effectively. Elena's ammunition situation remained critical. She still had only 5 rounds remaining, which would be insufficient for any sustained firefight.